Good evening. I'm John Dowson, and this is Community Report. Tonight we're pleased to have with us Terry Carter. Many of you probably know Terry Carter as Mr. Newmarket. And Terry is raised in Newmarket. He was the founder of the Historical Society, past editor of the Era. That's the predecessor of the current Era banner. He's a 20-year member of the Persicini Run Walkathon, and also the author of this book here called Newmarket, the Heart of York Region. By the way, if you would like a copy of this book, Terry will be having a book signing on the 31st of January this year at the Chapters, and you can get up and get a copy of that. In addition, Terry's working on a new book about the 1837 rebellion as it pertains to the Newmarket era, and he was also the recipient of the 125th anniversary of the Canadian Federation Commemorative Award for the 125th anniversary of Canada, and he's currently the general manager of the Newmarket Chamber of Commerce. I think I got it all in, Terry. Is that? Did I miss anything? Born in Toronto, raised in Newmarket. I think that was the story, right?
That was the story. Came here very young. Yep. Grew up here.
Very young.
Up in Newmarket.
Being what, a year old?
About that, yeah.
I talked to our mayor, current mayor Tom Taylor, one time. Said he was born in Kitchener. Came here when he was 6 months old. So I guess this is
same period, because Tom and I went to high school together.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
So you were raised here, meaning that you went to public school here.
Went to King George and Stuart Scott schools and Newmarket High School.
King George, is that the one downtown?
No, that's the one on Park Avenue. Yes.
In the old, what they call the old town, or
yeah.
part of Newmarket now.
Yeah.
Is that an old building? Do you know?
1912, I think, or 1911, somewhere in there.
So it's one of the new schools, I guess.
Well, new. It's the oldest one, probably still extant, but in those days, the Alexander Muir School, which went back to the 1890s, was still standing.
Well, a lot of people, as I say, know you as Mr. Newmarket, the Historical Society, which you founded in 1974, I think July 15th, according to the Terry Carter book. But maybe a lot of people don't know who Terry is. Being raised in Newmarket, going to George, was it King George?
King George, yeah.
School.
Stuart Scott.
And Newmarket High, I guess, would be the only high school at the time.
It was the only high school at the time. He didn't have a big choice, that's right.
Was it? No, well, it's not as big as it is now, but it was on...
it was on Prospect Street, and it was, in those days, without all the additions that stand on that building now. It was just the one old building that fronts onto Prospect Street, and therefore we had lots of football fields.
Well, did it cover the surrounding area as well as just Newmarket?
Students came all the way in from almost to Sutton in those days. They were bussed in from Keswick and north of Keswick.
They were?
Yeah.
So there wasn't much up that way as well as far as a high school, I'm assuming.
No, I'm not even sure there was one in Sutton in those days, although there may have been.
Now, when we were off camera here before, when we had this little glitch, the mics didn't work, but we were talking about your graduation from Newmarket High, and you and three other fellas got an old van of a sort and decided to tour Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, we bought an old Mercury panel truck and fitted it up with some camping equipment, and away we went. We spent almost a year on the road, as they said in the 1950s, I think after the Jack Kerouac book.
Oh, right, yeah, on the road, yeah.
We went west. Took us about 2 months to get to Vancouver, and we worked for a couple months in Vancouver to get some money together.
Where did you work there in Vancouver?
I worked at Woodward's department store. The other three fellows worked at other places. I don't remember.
I know that Hastings.
Don't remember where now. But yeah, we lived at the YMCA at 6th and 6th in New Westminster.
Oh, in New West.
New Westminster for a time. Then it was south to California. Spent a little bit of time in California, and then on down across to Texas and into Mexico.
Into Mexico?
Where we drove a good part of Mexico over the winter. From Acapulco, we saw down over to the other coast and up the center, and saw a lot of the archaeological sites and
but the Pueblos and things like this, yeah.
But yeah, the great monuments built by the Aztecs and so on, and the Toltecs, and then came back up the other way through Florida and Carolinas and Georgia and Washington, and by then we were getting into pretty cold weather, so we It was February in Washington. It was rainy, but once you get north of Washington, it turned pretty frigid. So it was to head home.
You're back into the old Canadian weather
Back
again.
into the old Canadian winter. Yeah, we got home sometime in March, I think.
Well, what did your folks think about this? I mean, you know, hoboing across the country.
Well, of course, at 19, there were some trepidations, but they didn't stand in our way, and the judgment proved right. We had a very good time and gained some great experience.
Well, did you work when you were in the U.S. as well? You know,
couldn't work in the U.S., not legally anyway.
No, I mean,
you had
yeah.
to do very menial jobs if you needed a few bucks, but we did work on the west coast in Canada.
Now that's, I know it's not that long ago, but I mean the roads weren't what they are today, 2-lane highways, things like that, so it'll be a fairly adventurous trip.
Even the Trans-Canada wasn't complete. There was a long stretch through northern Ontario that was still under construction at that point, but it was fairly good driving.
Did they all come back?
No, one fella kept going. 3 of us came back and settled down and made some money and went to college, and the 4th chap kept traveling and ended up settling down in New Zealand, where he got married.
So were these people all from Newmarket? These are
Newmarket and Keswick area, all Newmarket high school people, yeah.
So people, but you met in high school,
In
I
high
guess.
school, yes.
So like you formed a little, was this a club or something? You just sort of hung around together?
Just friends. And we're still friends. Talked to one of them, he lives in Ottawa now, talked to one of them yesterday about how he survived the ice storm, and we'll probably be talking to the rest very shortly.
So where did this come about? I mean, whose idea? Was this yours?
I don't remember whose idea it was. It just sort of coalesced, I think. The end of grade 13, as it was in those days, you were pretty fed up with school and didn't want to go back to college right away, so
well,
traveling was the thing to do in those days, John, you know.
I think, and a lot of people, a lot of students do that now, too. You know, go to Europe, backpack, that kind of thing. And through the 60s, it was a thing to do as well.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. In the 50s, it was North America was more accessible to our budgets, I think.
When did you go back to school when you came back here?
I worked for a year and then went back to school. Yeah.
So where did you go to school? What did you do then?
I went to Ryerson and took what they then called the Journalism and Graphic Arts course. The School of Journalism was designed to turn out people suited for the weekly newspaper business as opposed to the daily newspaper business. And so
what's the graphic arts to do with this?
Well, you learn how to run a press and how to set type and how to do all those things that a weekly newspaper editor and publisher had to know how to do.
So you would write the story and set the type?
Often, yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
In some of these?
And ironically, that's what people on most newspapers are doing now, because they write the story on a computer and commit it to a disk, and that's the typesetter.
I guess you're right. I never thought of that. So this was in Ryerson, downtown Toronto in the 50s, I
right
guess.
near Dundas and Yonge. It was a very colorful part of the city, and we lived a couple blocks away on Jarvis Street in an apartment in one of the old mansions, and made our living, 2 of us, my roommate and I, made our living driving a Diamond Taxi through that part of the city, which gave us good material. My roommate was one of the chaps I'd traveled with, and he was in the radio and television arts course. He's now a movie maker with the film board.
Well, colorful characters and colorful stories.
We saw a lot of the more colorful part of the city. Yes.
Well, that's a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun, yeah.
And then what happened after?
Good money.
Was it?
Good money for students, yeah.
So that was, did you do this while you were actually at school? I mean, at nights and things like this?
Night shifts. My roommate and I would split a week.
It wasn't like a weekend thing.
Oh, if you get a cab on a weekend, you took it, yeah, because it was better money.
And were those the days when they had, the cars, did they have radios in them, or were they ones that you flagged down kind of thing?
They had radios.
They did?
They had radios, although we would never reject a flag down either.
No, and make sure you give me a good sheet at the end of the night, you know.
Yes.
So you graduated from Ryerson, Ryerson, which is at the time a diploma, I think.
Institute of Technology, as it was called in those days, yeah.
And Crombie, David Crombie, wasn't he a teacher there at one time?
Not at the time I was there, no. I talked to David years later, and there wasn't a crossover. So
where did you go from there then? Now you're out into the world?
I got my first newspaper job on the Orillia Daily Packet and Times, which was even better journalism school than Ryerson, let me tell you. I spent 2 years there, from cub reporter to sports editor to district news editor, and you also got to make the printing plates and sweep the floor and open the shop at 6 o'clock in the morning and do the ticker tape stuff, and it was a great experience.
So all the big stories of what's happening in downtown Aurelia, I guess, in the late 50s.
Everybody got a shot at the big stories. It was a very small editorial staff, that's right.
And a dry town at that.
But it really was a dry town, just as Newmarket was in those days. You had to go across the river to get a beer, that's right.
To, what was it, Atherley?
Atherley, and
yeah.
Oasis.
The Atherley Arms. And now Casino-Rama's up that way now, isn't it?
Now, yeah.
In there.
Yeah.
And that was owned by Thompson? Was it a Thompson?
It was a Thompson newspaper. It had been for some years. He bought it as a weekly and converted it to a daily because it was far enough from the sphere of influence of the Toronto dailies, and there were 3 of them in those days, remember?
Oh, yeah, the Telegram
was going, and the Star and the Globe. But it really was far enough away from Toronto, he felt that it needed its own, would support its own daily newspaper, and he proved right.
But going from this course that you did to a daily newspaper, that's quite a jump.
It was an interesting transition, yeah.
Because every day you have a deadline, right?
Because the Thompson pay, well, twice a day, actually. The Thompson pay scale was not generous. They were considered a very good training ground for journalists, and on that basis, I think they started me at $35 a week, and when I left after 2 years, I was making a princely sum of $60-something, $66 a week, I think, which was considered a good pay scale in a Thompson newsroom.
Did you really go around with a hat with press written on it?
No, we didn't have to do that. No. But then the town was small enough that everybody knew you pretty soon anyway.
But did you have the pad and this kind of thing? How did you take the stories?
Pad and you took your own pictures, so you carried a great big Graflex camera and a battery pack that weighed about 20 pounds with you, and a pad and a pencil, and by the time you got somewhere, you were not only well equipped, but very, very obviously a reporter.
So you took your own photographs?
Oh, yes, and developed them, and often made the printing plates from them.
So when you would, well, I guess the scribe business, I mean, writing on your pad, what would you do, go back and have to type it up, or?
You did that, yes. There were typewriters, and there wasn't a big enough newspaper. You had a rewrite desk, so you couldn't phone it in. You had to go back so often. If you were at a hockey game, you would get back to the newsroom at 10:30, 11 o'clock, and then sit down and write your stories, and then...
This is in the evening?
In the evening, and then come in the morning and lay out the page, which had to be at the press downstairs by 9:45.
Oh, so it's an afternoon paper.
So the morning edition could get out. 2 editions a day, yeah.
Was there 2 editions?
Yeah. The morning edition came out around 10 o'clock, shortly after 10 o'clock. And we got so good that we could take a picture on the main street at 9-something and have it out on the street an hour later in the front page of the newspaper.
No kidding.
There was a festival or something going on.
Well, if you were one of these people that knew all about the typesetting, you didn't have to typeset it too, did you?
I could do that, but they had a typesetting shop with linotypes, and some professional fellows running those, so that wasn't necessary.
So you had the whole gamut, local news, sports. Did you do any municipal politics or anything like that?
Very little in Aurelia, because someone else already had that beat sewn up. I just got to fill in on that one.
And then where did you go from there? What was the next?
From there, I spent a couple of years as a magazine editor at McLean Hunter in the business magazine division.
What's that, for trade journals? And
trade journals, they called them then, yeah. A lumber magazine and a photography magazine, a bus and truck magazine, things like that. And from there, I accepted an offer to take over a small community newspaper in Scarborough called the Scarborough Mirror, which over the 6 years I was there grew from a small paper to become one of the largest, I guess the largest at the time in Canada.
Was it a new paper, or had it been?
It had just started. It just started a few weeks prior, and the chap who'd been the editor was killed in an automobile accident. So they offered me the opportunity to take it over.
And this was a weekly then, was it, or a daily?
It was a weekly. It was a weekly, covered Scarborough. And Scarborough then was all south of the 401, so it was a little more compact community than it is now.
Is it really Scarberia, as the people, you know? No.
We would tend to object to that designation.
Yeah. What was it like then, covering? That's a big area to cover. Did you do Toronto news as well, or?
No, we didn't do Toronto news. We did strictly Scarborough news. It was a Scarborough newspaper. People on Toronto news, they got the Star anyway, or the Telly, or the Globe.
And you were the editor then?
I was, yeah. Well, we started 12 to 16 pages. I was the editor and the whole staff for a while. By the time I left 6 years later, we were doing usually over 100 pages a week in several sections, and we had a fairly substantial staff.
100 pages? That's a fair size.
Tabloid size, it was. It was a big load of copy.
Now, how long were you there?
6 years.
6 years. But isn't the Mirror still going now?
It is, yes. Yeah. It's Metroland paper, just as the Era Banner is. Same company owns it.
And you left there for another sort of greener pasture, so to speak, or?
Yeah, I went downtown and worked very briefly at the Telegram and at the Globe and Mail on the rim and the rewrite desk.
Oh, the Telegram.
And then the job in Newmarket opened up, and
so you worked on the Globe for a while, did you?
Briefly, very briefly. Yeah.
And the Telegram? That was the
Telegram was extremely briefly. I was hired for the City Hall Bureau and told to show up on a Monday. And when I went in on the Monday, the chap who'd hired me wasn't there anymore. He'd been replaced, and his budget had been cut by half. And my job was one of the ones that was cut, so I spent one day, about 1.5 days, I think, on the City Hall Bureau before.
With the Telegram?
With the Telegram.
But it wasn't very
disappeared.
long after that the whole paper disappeared.
Oh, a year or so, I guess.
Yeah.
A year or so, because the whole paper disappeared after I came to Newmarket. Yeah, maybe 2 years after that.
Well, is this back at that time? Did you have to become a member of the press club, the Toronto Press Club, and sort of hang out there?
You know, but it was considered one of the things to do. Certainly, it was a good source of you know, lore, I guess, and sometimes leads.
Well, did you meet any of these sort of well-known or people like Pierre Burton and Zosky and some of those old reporters that were probably not old reporters, but
those two at that time, but yeah, certainly in the press club, everybody went there. You met everybody who was in the business one day or another.
Oh, how you doing, kid? I mean, did they help you out at all?
No, they sometimes buy a beer, but
no, but I mean, did they give you tips about how to pick a story and get the things and so on?
Not at the press club, no. It didn't talk much about that at the press club.
But starting in Ryerson, back in, I guess, the middle 50s, and then going through to Scarborough Mirror and then the Telegram and things, and then looking at it today, do you think journalism has changed somewhat?
The basic activity hasn't changed, but you still have to gather the news, and if you're on a paper such as the Era or the Aurelia paper, the news is still what goes on in your community.
Is it still the 5 W's, you know, who, what, where, why, and when? And
who, what, when, where, why?
Yeah, yeah.
It is, yes. Yes, that's what you build your news story on.
Because there's always been a lot of discussions now you hear on radio and television and so on about people talking about the reporters maybe make the news as opposed to reporting the facts or embellish it somewhat. Has that changed in that, do you think?
I guess some reporters always wanted to get there. Yeah. It's the style and the platform you have, but it wasn't the way I preferred journalism, and because my favorite part of the journalism activity was the community journalism. That was why I came back to the community newspapers, and why I came back to the Era Banner, the Era as it was then. And
when was that? When did you come back here to Newmarket?
Late 1968. I came
and
back.
You became the editor of the Era, the Newmarket Era at that time.
It was then, yeah.
Which was the town newspaper.
Well, at that point, it was the only newspaper. There had been a second newspaper called the Post, but the Mr. Bassett, the Telegram, had bought the Era and I guess the Post at the same time and amalgamated them, and it was some months later when I was hired to come up here
to edit the Era.
Yeah.
How old was the paper then at that time?
Well, it was started in 1853, 52, I guess.
So it would have been over 100 years old, or close to 100 years old at that time.
Yeah.
Oh, and in the 60s when you came here.
So I guess it was over 100 then. We did the 125th anniversary edition in 1970. So.
The paper was then, where was it, the office for the Era?
Oh, it was on Charles Street. The Main Street location had burned in the 1950s, and it had been moved to Charles Street next door to the beer store. Neither business are in those locations now, but the buildings are still there.
This is on Charles Street where the film factory is now,
yeah,
in that area.
Same street, yeah.
And were you the only, I mean, how many did they have then? How many staff?
I couldn't tell you the total number, but in the newsroom there were only 3 of us at the time. We were all doing pretty well everything. The big addition a couple of years later was to hire a photographer, so the rest of us didn't have to take pictures as well as do everything else. And it eventually grew as the town grew and the paper grew and its advertising base grew. And when I left there in 1985, we had a staff of, I think, 9.
So you were there, what's that, 16 years?
18 years.
18 years as the editor of the Era in Newmarket. But that must
Part of that time I was editor of the Banner, too, when the two companies amalgamated, Metro Span and Inland amalgamated to become the current company.
The Banner was the paper in Aurora.
Aurora. So, yeah, so I was editor of both papers, but they were not amalgamated papers. They ran independently.
But they were owned by the same company.
They were for a brief.
That must have been something to come back to Newmarket in 1969 as the Era editor of the Era, and here's the paper which I guess you grew up, you would be reading, going to school and that here.
It was interesting going back through some of the back files, yeah, and looking at newspapers from an earlier day when I had been growing up here.
Was this something you always wanted to do, to come back to the hometown?
It was really a fluke. It was a fluke. The chap who was running the community newspapers for the Telegram Corporation had lived in Scarborough, knew me from my work at the Scarborough Mirror, and when this job came open, he got control of the Era and wanted somebody to take over as editor. He just gave me a call, and I happened to be very happy to come. He didn't know I was from Newmarket.
He didn't?
Just a fluke in that regard. He was just looking for someone with community newspaper experience, and I happened to be available because I was not enjoying the downtown work.
But being a hometown boy and coming back, how to report on people you knew.
Well, yeah, kind of tough at first, but people got used to it, and I got used to it.
And what was the sort of the focus of the paper at the time? Was it a sort of a tabloid type thing, which it is now?
No, it was a broadsheet paper, as the midweek one still is. Broadsheets for pages were much bigger then because paper was cheaper and presses were different. But the news focus was still community news, and one of the things I instituted was a really heavy-duty coverage of Town Hall. We went to, and it was me who ended up doing it, went to most of the committee meetings and the council meetings and the committee of the whole meetings and followed stories through and kept a pretty strong focus on your town council. And ironically, several of them were people I'd gone to high school with.
Oh, the councilors?
The councilors, yeah. And it wasn't long before Bob Foran, who'd been in my year in high school, became the mayor. But we kept a pretty strong focus on Town Hall in those years and on the county council, which later became the regional council.
Well, what were some of the things, how could you, as you say, keep a focus on the council or the municipal politics?
Well, simply by covering them, by going to all those meetings and following the stories through from the time they first surfaced in a committee meeting to the committee of the whole meeting to the council.
And doing background and that kind of thing as well.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Well, did you have any reporters besides yourself that you could sort of send out on these stories to follow up or do digging and that kind of thing?
There were, as I say, there were 3 of us in the newsroom, and one did sports pretty well exclusively, and with George Haskett's feed for years.
George Haskett
was not on staff, but he was the sports editor of the Era for I don't know how many years, probably 40 years, and from back in the 20s, I think he wrote for the Era, and used to send us miles of sports results and things. It was just great. Went to all the games and was an extremely familiar figure in town, and didn't miss anything on the sports scene.
This was the Newmarket Redmen, were big then, right? And the smoke rings.
There was a second edition of the Newmarket Redmen when I was here. The smoke rings were in the 50s before I came back. There was an earlier edition of the Redmen in the 30s that went to the national championships as well.
Oh, there was. Was it a junior A team or a senior or what was?
I think it was a junior A, but I'm not sure.
So I came here in 1974, so I'm one of the new people, I guess.
Oh yeah, right? Just a recent immigrant.
A recent immigrant, yeah. But and so you would be the editor then in the paper I was reading when I arrived. Yeah,
I was at that point. Yeah.
So what were some of the big stories that you may have covered in that 18 years that you were there?
Oh gosh, it was just a continuing saga of the change of the town. The town was When I came back, I guess the town was 10,000 people, and then there was an annexation, and it went to 24,000, and now it's what, it's over 60,000.
There was an annexation? What was that?
They annexed land north of Davis Drive. All that part of what is now Newmarket north of Davis Drive was part of East Gwillimbury in those days.
Oh, it was?
Where you lived, John.
Yeah, in 1969? Was it?
69 or 70, that all became part of Newmarket, yeah.
Oh,
so that was a very big story for the year. And the ramifications of that change in municipal structure, which brought in regional government and brought in new town boundaries, went on for a long, long time as the details were fought out, because things like the hydro systems didn't mesh and the road systems didn't mesh, and there were all kinds of cost implications for the taxpayers in that amalgamation. And we're probably facing that again in the next 3 years, as you know.
Yeah, but we may have amalgamations
again. They don't realize what they're getting into.
No. But so when you came here in '69, this was at the cusp of the region. Wasn't here then at that time? It was still the county?
We still went to county council, that's right. County council met once a month for 3 days in a row. On
once
the third
a month?
day they had a big party.
Where did they meet? Here?
On Bayview Avenue, which was then the old, or Bayview Avenue, on the road up to past, on the way to Ola Madsen's greenhouse at the top of the hill there was the county.
So you'd have reported on the amalgamation, all the proposals for the new region and that type of thing?
All that stuff, yeah. The coming of the GO train. There was a huge campaign run by a Mount Albert lawyer named John Medcoff to get the government to put a GO train in on this track, which eventually was successful. But John went so far as to hire a train himself and run it down the track, and to prove that there was the customer base there for a commercial GO train operation. And he ran a train one day to Aurora and back, and sure enough, he filled it up. And
he did.
That was a big story, and we of course sent photographers and reporters on the train, and we had supported John's campaign for a GO train, and when it came, that was another big story, and I hope it keeps running. I hear that track's for sale now.
Yeah, I understand it is.
CN has applied to tear it up. So,
well, we're going to take just a short break, and when we come back, we want to talk about some of the other things, but particularly about the book and the book signing and things like that. So don't go away. We'll be right back with Terry Carter.
In television land, I am the law, with judge and jury in my hand. Television is where I go to take the planet's temperature, because the truth is out there. Television land has a population the size of me, 1 billion times over, and I vote for more.
In 1990, Rogers began making your neighborhood one of the most future-ready in the world, surrounding it with a fiber-optic cable infrastructure for more channels, interactivity, and the future knows what else.
You're not gonna miss all this, are you?
Local people express their thoughts, feelings, and dreams through poetry. Catch the Millennial Wave on Rogers Community Television.
Join us for discussions exploring the UFO phenomena and spirituality with UFO investigators, contactees, and ordinary people leading extraordinary lives. Cross over the threshold on Rogers Community Television.
Cyberspace is TV for your fingers, and you're doing the transmitting. Cyberspace is lipstick and chainsaws and anything you want to say. It's a 12-year-old with an opinion on war, the power to say up Periscope in a sea of knowledge. It's a connection machine with no fixed address, and I want to be hardwired.
Introducing The Wave from Rogers. High-speed internet access by cable modem. Download in seconds, not minutes.
In my world, I greet the future with a wave. You're not going to miss all this, are you?
Watch for MP-MPP Report. Having a voice in the political realm is more important today than ever. Hear what your MP or MPP has to say, here on Rogers Community Television. The prostate dilemma. This disease is rarely spoken of, but has a fatality rate equivalent to breast cancer in women. To get a better insight and to help men overcome their fears, watch The Prostate Dilemma on Rogers Community Television.
We're back, and we're talking with Citizen of the Year for 1997, Terry Carter. And Terry, when we left, we were talking about your years with the Bassett. I think it was the Bassett newspapers.
Well, the Telegram Corporation, which was owned by Mr. Bassett and the Eatons, I guess.
And they owned the Era Banner, or the Era at the time as well?
They owned the Era. They bought the Era and the Stouffville Tribune, and they established a company called Inland Publishing Company, which was to buy community newspapers eventually all around GTA. The theory being that they would control the growth of other newspapers in the hinterland of their downtown daily newspapers. And they operated as a very, very successful company. I think it probably made more money than the Telegram did eventually. For some years, but eventually, when the Telegram met its fate, Metroland or Inland was sold to a similar company that Toronto Star ran,
which is the Metroland,
which was called Metrospan at that time, and the amalgamation of the two companies became Metroland Publishing Company, and then it was renamed Metroland Printing, Publishing, and Distributing Company some years later.
So, did you at the same time also look after a paper in Richmond Hill, the now defunct Highlander?
We started one called the Highlander because the Stars company, Metrospan, had the Liberal. And,
so this was the rival.
This was to be the rival. And it ran fairly successfully for, I guess, about a year and a half, but budget considerations within the company, unrelated to the Highlander, forced them to cut the paper because newspapers are never profitable in their first 2 or 3 years, and this one hadn't been going more than just about a year, or a little over a year, when the money crunch came, and so it was one of the casualties.
Well, so when was that? What year would that be?
Probably 72 or 73. I'm not sure.
And so you saw the whole spectrum of development, I guess, from 1969 to 1985. From not just a citizen living here, but from someone who had to report on it.
A privileged point of view, yes.
Yeah.
I saw the inside of a lot of those deals and a lot of the decisions, because I sat through the committee meetings and the planning meetings and the committee of the whole meetings and the council meetings that made those decisions, and saw the negotiations going on in the planning sessions with the developers, and it was very interesting to watch the process take place. And it's too bad it doesn't seem to be quite as open today, and I'm not sure why, whether the newspapers don't have the staff to do it, or whether the politicians don't consider themselves as accountable, but the process doesn't seem to be as open today.
Well, there's close to 60,000, I think, living in Newmarket now, which includes
the official population is 60,000, and we always figured there was considerably more than that, because there's a lot of basement apartments and other unregistered residences which don't count in that figure.
And when you came here, it was 10,000 people. I mean, 69. But when you lived here, was it that?
Oh, when I grew up here, it was 4,000.
That's all?
Was consistently under 5,000 for many years.
When you went to high school, would it be still about the same, 4,000 or 5,000?
Yeah, 5,000 to 6,000, I think.
So it was a sleepy little 5,000 community for a long time.
Well, it was. Yeah, don't forget, there was no 404 highway, there was no 400 highway even. You had to come up Yonge Street in the 50s. I don't think there was even a woodbine to the lake. You had to come, to get to Lake Simcoe, you had to come through Newmarket and go up through Sharon and Queensville.
But when you were living here, was the tannery still operating, and those other
three big businesses in town, the Davis Leather Tannery and the Office Specialty Factory, which had 2 big buildings on Timothy Street in the valley there, and the Dixon Pencil Factory. They were the 3 major employers. So these are the
major employers, and yet the population didn't really...
They're all gone now.
Expand, and they're all gone.
They're all gone now.
Did you have to report on any of this stuff? I mean, they would do things for the town, I guess, from time to time, and news items.
Oh, when they were large and active, they were very involved in the life of the town. They were usually the employees of the 3 factories on the council, and there are people who did stay involved in the life of the town.
But were you on the paper then at the time with the big fire that I heard about one of the buildings?
The Office Specialty building?
Yeah.
I was, yes, I was. The building was empty at the time. It was being demolished. It was
it was?
The one on between Timothy and Water Street. And a torch, one of the wreckers' torches, set off fire in some of the old sawdust that was in the woodworking building, and the whole place went up like a torch. It's a fire you could see for miles. And it was kind of... matter of fact, we were at a county council meeting that day, and we all had to leave the county council meeting to go to the fire.
Cover the big news item.
Yeah, but I think the county council meeting came to a halt too, because I saw a lot of the councilors there very shortly.
Well, when you lived in Newmarket, when you were going to school and everything, you lived in Park. Did you live on Park Avenue then?
Most of that time, yeah.
And that
Timothy Street and then Park Avenue.
That would be almost the edge of town at that time.
My father built the house on Park Avenue in the late 1940s, and it was actually out of town. Then the town boundary ended several hundred yards to the east of the lot that he purchased, and Park Avenue ended just past our house at a maple bush owned by the Lewis family. But now we're considered the old part of town. I happen to own that house. I bought it from Dad when he couldn't keep it any longer, and it's considered the old part of town. Of course, the town goes way, way beyond us now.
But the part where you lived if you went east towards the main street, a lot of that would still be familiar, I guess, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it has changed very little. It's nice to see a lot of those older houses in the last few years have been renovated and really spruced up. They look good. I
know, because I see some of them with the plaques on and that kind of. Did that start when you were around putting?
No, the LACAC committee. Well, it started when I was at the newspaper, but I guess it was after the Historical Society started, so I guess it was probably the late 70s.
Because if you go down to the main street now and walk up the main street, is there anything still familiar? I mean, the stores have changed, but the buildings.
Well, the building outlines are still basically the same. There are one or two changes, but you look at the skyline of the main street and you look at pictures I have in my collection from 1890s, and the buildings themselves are very much the same. The actual store facades have changed, the windows have changed, the signs, of course, have changed, and some of the detail, but the buildings, a lot of them have remained much the same.
So what was it like then when you were going to high school? Was it a sort of a busy town, a bustling place, or?
Saturday was the big day.
It was.
Everybody, all the country folk, the farm folks came in to shop on Saturday, and they shopped on Newmarket's Main Street.
They did?
It was a very busy day. Friday night and Saturdays were busy.
Did the store stay open late then?
8 or 9 o'clock. Of course, going back a few years before that, when there was an army camp in town, the place really bustled on the weekend.
Well, that must have been interesting because, well, yeah, you'd be just a young person and then.
In public school in those days. But I certainly remember the army camp and remember the downtown being full of soldiers on passes.
This was during the Second World War?
Yes.
And then the camp was up on Shrigley somewhere, I think, up in that
where
area.
The Prince Charles School stands today was just about where the gateway to the camp was, yeah.
That must have been a busy time.
There were, often, I guess, several thousand soldiers at any given time training at that camp.
And they'd be in town, so that would have put a boost to the town as well.
It was a big boost for the town economy, I think, during the war, because they all got paid and they all came to spend their money on, film and food.
And here it was a dry town.
It was a dry town, and that was why it was a dry town through the war. The local folks didn't want a wet town with an army camp in town.
And I noticed, I remember...
There were canteens in the camp that served beer.
There was?
Yeah.
I mean, they have to be, right?
Yeah, special, special arrangement, but not anywhere in town.
Now, in your book, you talk also about the main street and there was two movie theaters, I think, on the...
Well, at different times. There was always one movie theater on the main street in those days. First, the Strand, which stood on the south end of Main Street on the east side, and then when it closed, the Roxy was built on
the Roxy, every time.
West side, and it's now the youth center. That building's now the youth center.
Oh, that was a theater then?
That was a theater. That was the theater. And it operated until, I guess, until the Odeon Cineplex was built out on the Glenway subdivision.
Now, I saw, I think we were talking about this, a little film clip on I think it was during the Second World War, 1995, with the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. There was, the National Film Board did a series on the war, Canada at War, and there was this little short film clip in the beginning which showed Newmarket about 1939.
Was there?
And it looked like there was a Canadian Tire store right on the main street. And again, the street hadn't changed that much.
There was. The Canadian Tire store started at the corner of Timothy and Main in the northwest corner. There's a little computer store in there now, in that part of that building. And Joe Spillett had a variety store in there, and he got the Canadian Tire franchise and expanded to a Canadian Tire store. Then when that became too small, they moved it across the street and down the block a bit, next to the old Loblaws building, where the flea market is today. And then eventually it moved, of course, out to Davis Drive location.
And now look, we have this big box
yeah.
store.
It's moved twice since. It moved to Yonge Street, and then now it's moved up Yonge Street.
From this little...
So it's been a great growth story there over, what, 40 years, I guess, 50 years.
And during the time you were the editor, that's when this idea of starting a historical society came up. Was this your idea, or...?
Well, Lisa Lowe, who was the chief librarian at the public library at the time, and had been in town a couple of years, and she said she was had never worked in a town this size that didn't have a historical society, and every time I'd go into the library, she'd be at me to get something going through the newspaper. So we published a notice. There hadn't been much interest in local history up till then, so I'd been doing a few columns in the paper, and that's why she focused on me, I guess, history columns. So we published a notice saying there'd be a meeting at the old Fire Hall Auditorium on Main Street. Anybody who was interested in starting a historical society, come out, and if there were enough people who came out, we'd do something. And much to my amazement, we almost filled the hall.
Really?
So we then started what we called the Newmarket Historical Committee, and we called it a committee because nobody was quite sure how well it would do or how long it would survive, and we wanted people to feel free to donate their papers and photographs and so on to it, so we could start an archives collection. So Bob Foran, who was mayor at the time, said, well, call the committee and I'll designate it a committee of council.
Oh, I see.
By bylaw. And so if anything happens to your committee, any of its possessions won't go out of town to the Royal Ontario Museum or the Ontario Historical Society, but rather will become the property of the municipality. So that was why we started it out as a committee. And some years later, when it was a very successful organization and still growing, the membership decided to change the name to Historical Society, because obviously it was well enough established that its collections would survive no matter what.
So what was the objective? Is it was to sort of retain for future generations?
Research and preservation, yeah. Research the history of the town and preserve it, and we'd hoped eventually to start a museum. And we did set up a museum committee, which got things going, and eventually it became expedient for that to become an independent body, a museum board, because that was the way to qualify best for provincial grants for a museum. So the museum was spun off from the Historical Society and became an organization unto itself.
There's an interesting book I picked up some time ago, Newmarket, Some Early Memories by Elman Campbell. And the Newmarket Museum is now called the Elman W. Campbell Museum. It's in honor of him.
Yeah, in honor of Elman. He put an awful lot of time and energy into that museum. He was when it was spun off from the Historical Society, he became the first chairman of the new museum board and remained chairman for many years. And even after time forced him to step aside, he continued his interest and his support and supported it financially as well as
he did,
as well as with many artifacts and many recollections, such as he contributed. Those are actually columns he did for the Historical Society newsletter, which were later published in that form. I think there's 2 of those books out.
Is there? This I picked up about almost 10 years ago, and you're mentioned in here. Terry Carter, editor of the Newmarket Era, took up the cause of forming a Newmarket Historical Society. It's July 15th, 1974. But he also mentions here that there was another fellow you had been working with at some time, Ned Rowe, R-O-E, who was the grandson of William Rowe.
Ned was the grandson of William
Still
Rowe,
alive
the
then?
First, the fur trader who came here after the War of 1812 and began trading with the native trappers under the great elm tree on Timothy Street, which became the New Market.
Oh, that's where the town...
That's where the town got its name, from Ned's fur trading post, and he built a store on the trading post on the main street at the very bottom of Main Street on the east side. And eventually he prospered, and he built quite a large house and trading post there with docks and other facilities on the east side facing the river. Water was high enough, evidently, that canoes could come that far south on the Holland River with their trade loads then, and so his trading post faced the east and the river, and his fur trading post and his general store faced the main street, and he lived in the house as well. And he also had the post office in the house.
This would be down near where Ferry Lake is now?
Well, about where the old Loblaw store, where the flea market building is today.
That would be
that
the
was
place.
the Rowe property.
That was the Rowe property.
We've only found one photo of that building standing, and it's not a good one. It's taken from some distance, but that locates it there.
And Ned, this person who was alive at that time in '74,
when I came
was
back
his
to town,
grandson.
Ned had retired from in the publishing business in New York and was living on Church Street. Now, William Rowe married twice, and Ned was descended from the second family. William, his first wife died when he was in his 60s, I believe, and he remarried a much younger woman and had another family of seven.
Of which Ned was the...
And Ned, yeah, was the offspring of one of those people. So that explains the long time gap between Mr. Rowe Sr., the founder of the Newmarket, and his grandson, who was still alive in my time. Now, Ned was in his 80s, and we became quite good friends, and he had a great collection of his grandfather's papers in the house, and he also had the sword his great-grandfather had used to command the artillery detachment at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham.
Really?
Which, unfortunately, he thought might stay in town, but after his death didn't. The executor of his estate was a nephew, and he took it away and said it would eventually wind up in the National Collection, where I guess it is a good place for it.
So his great-grandfather was on the Plains of Abraham.
That's right. Yes, was a young British naval lieutenant who commanded the detachment detailed to bring the cannon up onto the Plains of Abraham the night before the battle with Montcalm.
So was Ned, the grandson of this founder of the town of Newmarket, William Rowe, was he around at this time when you did the historical, started the Historical Society?
No, he's another one who had been urging me to start the Historical Society because he said, I want someplace to leave some of these things. He had a dining room table that had belonged to his grandfather, beautiful piece made, and he had some other furniture that had come across with his great-grandfather from England and so on, and he wanted to be able to leave that to some organization in the town, so he was after me to start the Historical Society. He left most of that material, some paintings as well, of the family with me. He knew we were getting one going, and he directed his executors to leave those things with me, and they are now in the museum.
Well, they are.
They are. An interesting old chair that William Rowe had brought back from Montreal, quite an ornate, very comfortable chair, which was called the Bishop's Throne, because whenever Bishop Strawn came to St. Paul's Anglican Church to preach as a guest speaker, he would stay with the Rowes, and he loved this chair, and he always sat in this chair, and it became known as the Bishop's Throne.
Oh, I see. Is that in the museum now?
It's now in the museum, that chair, and some other things that Ned left for me to take care of until the museum got started, because he knew eventually we would have one.
And you left the Era Banner, or now the Era. Was it still called the Era Banner in '85? When did this come about?
It became the Era Banner after I left. As long as I was there, we had the Era in Newmarket and the Banner in Aurora, and the twain didn't meet, but sometime after I left, they amalgamated them.
And you went into writing and publishing, I think. Is it the Elm Tree Publishing Company?
I started a little company called Elm Tree Publishing Company, which is the co-publisher of this book, and but mainly does corporate newsletters and will do my next book on its own, and has done a few other small books. But
were you connected at all with the other paper that came into town? What was it called, the News, or?
I was a part owner of the News for a time, and I was the publisher and editor of the News for a time. But
was that the Independent News or the Newmarket News?
No, it was just called the Newmarket News when we were there.
And that's the forerunner of the other paper that's in town now, the Crier, the Town Crier?
Yeah, they assumed some of the assets and things, the boxes and so on.
Because we have two now.
Yeah.
Was there two weeklies before? Had there been two?
Over the years, many times there had been two weeklies going right back to the beginning, almost. There was always somebody tried to start a paper to take on the Era. It's often for political purposes. If Mr. Jackson, the longtime editor and publisher of the Era, was a reform liberal, and liberals or conservatives would start their own newspaper, or if he came out as a conservative. Politics are much more partisan for newspapers in those days. Often the other paper started by the other party and eventually petered out.
Well, when I was here in '74, I was very, well, still am to some degree, active in the theater group, the Newmarket Theater, the stage company, and Ruby Haskett used to do the reviews of the plays.
Yes.
Was she related at all to this other person?
That was his wife.
Oh, was it?
He did the sports, and Ruby did the theater for many years before I came, and for some time after I came back.
Because I still have some of those clippings, you know, especially the ones that say something nice about me.
Yes, Ruby did the theater column for us for many, many years.
Now,
I think Ruby's somebody that should be recognized here in this theater. She made a great contribution to the Newmarket theater community over many years.
She did, yes, and she used to report on the plays and the things in Aurora as well, and sometimes would go to Toronto. And
her favorite focus, of course, was Newmarket, but as the era's field of interest expanded in the 70s to include, because the era did editions in what we called the South Shore edition, Keswick area, and we had an Aurora edition as well.
Because she was always...
We encouraged her to go abroad, yeah.
She's always very objective.
Yes.
Now, how did this book come about? What was this, a collection of,
the research started with the columns I did in the year. I did a history column for years in the year, just a anecdotal history column. So I had all this material, and when a company called Windsor Publishing out of California, which specialized in local histories, came to town and wanted somebody to write it, they hired me to do it. But unfortunately, they went bankrupt while the book was at the printers, and it didn't get printed. So I managed to acquire the rights and the plates and the material back, and eventually made a deal with Dundurn House, a Toronto publisher, to publish it in conjunction with Elm Tree House, my publishing company.
So this is my autographed copy that I have here, of course, but you will be up at Chapters on the 31st of January.
I've been invited to a signing party at Chapters on that afternoon, 4 o'clock on that Saturday afternoon. Apparently it's a day of local authors, and I'm not going to be the only one there. Quite a few local authors will be there, and we'll give a little talk about our book and then sign copies.
So if someone wanted to purchase a copy, where would they get this?
Well, Chapters have a good stock of them in. Great Books on Main has them. We have some at the Chamber office. They are getting near the end of the run. Before Christmas, there were about 200 left in the warehouse, and so I'm not sure how many are even left now. I haven't checked lately.
Because I've gone through this book, I've read quite a bit of it. Some of it, of course, doesn't relate to me too much because I came in late, and I'm one of the new people. But it's interesting, the research has gone into this. It must have taken a lot of time.
It was fun. It's a hobby of mine, and I always enjoyed local. It's more fun to research things where you can go out and see and talk to people and experience the history rather than research something that happened in Europe 300 years ago, and it really not a big connection for you.
It's more like living history.
So it's more like living history, and when you can meet people like Ned Rowe who can tell you the stories their grandfather passed down to them, and you have those firsthand, almost it really makes it fascinating.
Now, this new book that you're working on, the 1837 Rebellion, will it be something similar to this?
It will, yeah. It'll be about the same size in terms of number of pages, probably a slightly different format. It's very interesting. This was really the heart of the 1837 rebellion. There were other parts of it was then the colony that erupted, and where men resorted to arms and actually marched. But this is where it all happened. It was the 500 or so people who marched down Yonge Street with their pitchforks and their squirrel rifles.
From Newmarket?
From Newmarket and East Gwillimbury, and even as far up as Georgina and Bradford, and from Aurora, but a lot went from Newmarket. And after the battle, which was a real debacle, thanks to Mackenzie's lack of organizational skills, a lot of them fled north again. There's a kind of one man from Sharon who, because they were horsemen hunting them in the woods along Yonge Street, he got to a back concession and he walked backwards for a couple of concessions so his footprints would appear going the other way.
Oh, yeah.
And he finally got home, but unfortunately for him, Mackenzie had abandoned a list of his supporters at the tavern, which fell into the hands of the government. And so within a few days, he had been arrested and was marched all the way back down to Toronto on a chain.
The right way this time.
Going the right way. They were incarcerated for a while at kirk, the Presbyterian kirk on Timothy Street, which of course isn't there anymore, but
yeah, that's what I heard.
a one-room church at the time.
There was a jail here, or a temporary jail.
Temporary jail. The building had been finished but not used as a church at that point. So the government commandeered it and filled it full of rebels who were held there until the middle of January, when they had enough of them to march south, and they tied them all to a big chain and made them walk all the way back down to the Parliament buildings, which were then on Front Street, which was also being used as a jail. And they were held there for, many of them without trial, for months and months.
They were.
And this man, some of his cellmates went to trial and were acquitted or put on a bond of good behavior and sent home. One day some of these fellows were being released and the door was left open and he just walked out. He had another friend, a chap from Queensville called Moore, just walked out. Nobody stopped them, so they went to Buffalo.
They did?
Just didn't stop walking until they got to Buffalo. And they stayed as exiles in Buffalo for a couple of years until it was safe for them to come home. They wouldn't be picked up again.
So this was this rebellion right here. Our own Newmarket has all this history.
Took part in Mackenzie's first meeting that summer. Was held here. We put a plaque on the old town hall a couple of years ago commemorating that. It was held at the corner of Botsford and Maine. There was a hotel there then which had a porch on it, which was a bit of a raised platform, which he used as a speaking stage, and he had a huge rally, huge for that day, about 600 people, which was about twice the population of the town.
Right. Were some of them killed? Were some of them hung?
Some of the people from here were... a man from Sharon was killed at the battle, and a man from Stouffville was killed at the battle. I don't think anybody from Newmarket was actually killed at the battle. Lount from Landing was hung for treason. A man from Sharon was sent to Van Diemen's Land as a prisoner and died there.
Well, when you get this new book, well, we're running out of time here, so when you hit the new book, we could come back and we'll talk about that, because that's an interesting time. Thank you very much, Jerry, for being here.
Thank you, John.
And I'm John Dowson. Thank you for watching, and good night.